everyone, welcome back to Roots with Rune B with me, Rune B. And today we are going to continue with our read of Oliver Twist. Normally I would be joined by my friend Robert, who reads with me. Unfortunately, he had other obligations, so he will be back with us shortly. But today I am going to read for you, and it will be me all by my lonesome. And because that, I will only be doing one chapter. And I believe we are on chapter 18. But I'm not entirely sure because I'm rubbish at Roman numerals. So forgive me if I've gotten the chapter wrong. But chapter 18, in which a notable plan is discussed and determined on. It was a chill, damp, windy night when the Jew, buttoning up his greatcoat tight around his shriveled body and pulling the collar up over his ears so as to completely obscure the lower part of his face, emerged from his den. He paused on the step as the door was locked and chained behind him, and having listened while the boys made all secure, and until their retreating footsteps were no longer audible, slunk down the street as quickly as ever he could. The house to which Oliver had been conveyed was in a neighbourhood of Whitechapel. The Jew stopped for an instant on the corner of the street, and glancing suspiciously around, crossed the road and struck off in the direction of Spitalfields. The mud lay thick upon the stones, the black mist hung over the streets, the rain fell sluggishly down, and everything felt cold and clammy to the touch. It seemed just the night when it befitted such a being as the Jew to be abroad. As he glided stealthily along, creeping beneath the shelter of the walls and doorways, the hideous old man seemed like some loathsome reptile, engendered in the slime and darkness through which he moved, crawling forth by night in search of some rich offal for a meal. He kept on his course through many a winding and narrow ways until he reached Bethnal Green, and then turning off suddenly to the left, he soon became involved in a maze of mean and dirty streets which abounded in that closely and densely populated quarter. The Jew was evidently too familiar with the ground he traversed, however, to be bewildered at all, either by darkness of night or by the intricacies of the way. He hurried through several alleyways and streets, and at length he turned into one, lighted only by a single lamp at the far end. At the door of the house in this street he knocked, and having exchanged a few muttered words with the person who opened it, walked upstairs. A dog growled as he touched the handle of the room door, and a man's voice demanded who was there. "Only me, Bill. Only me, my dear," said the Jew, looking in. Bring your body in, then," said Sikes. "Lie down, you stupid brute. Don't you know the devil when he's got the greatcoat on?" Apparently the dog had been somewhat deceived by Mr. Fagin's outer garment, for as the Jew unbuttoned it and threw it over the back of the chair, he retired to the corner from which he had risen, wagging his tail as he went, to show that he was well satisfied, as it was in his nature to be. "Well," said Sikes. "Well, my dear," replied the Jew. "Ah, Nancy." The latter recognition was uttered with just enough embarrassment to imply a doubt of its reception, for Mr. Fagin and his young friend had not met since she interfered on behalf of Oliver. All doubts upon the subject, if he had any, were speedily removed by the young lady's behaviour. She took her feet off the fender and pushed back her chair, and bade Fagin to draw his up, without saying more about it. For it was a cold night, make no mistake. "It is cold, Nancy dear," said the Jew, as he warmed his skinny hands over the fire. "It seems to go right through one," added the old man, touching his side. "It must be a piercer if it finds a way through your heart," Mr. Sikes said. "Give him something to drink, Nancy. Burn my body, make haste." It's enough to turn a man ill to see his lean old carcass shivering in that way, like an ugly old ghost risen up from the grave. Nancy quickly brought a bottle from the cupboard, in which there were many, which, to judge from diversity of their appearance, were filled with several kinds of liquids. Sikes, pouring out a glass of brandy, bade the Jew drink it off. Quite enough, thank you, Bill, replied the Jew, putting the glass down after setting it to his lips. What? You're afraid of our getting it the better of you, are you? Inquired Sikes, fixing his eyes on the Jew. Ugh. With this hoarse grunt of contempt, Mr. Sikes seized the glass and threw the remainder of its contents into the ashes, as a peremptory ceremony to filling it again for himself, which he did at once. The Jew glanced around the room as his companion tossed down a second glassful, not in curiosity, for he had seen it often, but in a restless and suspicious manner, as which was habitual to him. It was a meanly furnished apartment, which was nothing but the contents of a closet, to induce the belief that the occupier was anything but a working man, and with no more suspicious articles displayed to view than 2 or 3 heavy bludgeons which stood in the corner, and a life-preserver that hung over the chimney-piece. There, said Sikes, smacking his lips. I'm ready now. For business, inquired the Jew. For business, replied Sikes. So, what have you got to say? About the crib at Chertsey, Bill, said the Jew, drawing his chair forward and speaking on a very low voice. Yes, what about it? Inquired Sikes. Ah, I know what you mean, my dear, said the Jew. He knows what I mean, Nancy, don't he? No, he don't, sneered Mr. Sikes, or he won't, and that's the same thing. Speak out and call things by their right names. Don't sit there winking and blinking and talking to me in hints, as if you weren't the very first that thought about the robbery. What do you mean? Hush, Bill, hush, said the Jew, who had in vain attempted to stop this burst of indignation. Somebody will hear us, my dear. Somebody will hear. Let them hear, said Sikes. I don't care. But as Mr. Sikes did care, upon reflection, he dropped his voice as he said the words, and grew calmer. There now, said the Jew coaxingly. It was only my caution, nothing more, my dear. Now, about that crib at Chertsey. When is it to be done, Bill, hey? When is it to be done? Such a plate, my dear, such a plate, said the Jew, rubbing his hands and elevating his eyebrows in rapture of anticipation. Not at all, replied Sikes coldly. Not to be done at all, echoed the Jew, leaning back in his chair. Not at all, rejoined Sikes. At least it can't be a put-up job, as we expected. Then it hasn't been gone about properly, said the Jew, turning pale with anger. Don't tell me. But I will tell you, retorted Sikes. Who are you that's not to be told? I told you that Toby Crackit has been hanging about the place for a fortnight, and he can't get one of the servants into a line. Do you mean to tell me, Bill, said the Jew, softening as the other grew heated, that neither of the 2 men in the house can be gotten over? Yes, I do mean to tell you so, replied Sikes. The old lady has had 'em these 20 years, and if you were to give 'em £500 they wouldn't be in it. But you mean to say, my dear, remonstrated the Jew, that the woman can't be gotten over? Not a bit of it. Not by Flash Toby Crackit, the Jew said incredulously. Think what women are, Bill. Not even by Flash Toby Crackit, replied Sikes. He's worn sham whiskers and a canary waistcoat, and the whole blessed time he's been loitering there. It's all of no use. He should have tried mustachios, and a pair of military trousers, my dear. So he did, rejoined Sikes, and they weren't no more of use than that other plant. The Jew looked blank at this information, and after ruminating for some minutes, with his chin sunk on his breast, he raised his head and said, with a deep sigh, that if Flash Toby Crackit reported all right, he feared the game was up. And yet, said the old man, dropping his hands on his knees. It's a sad thing, my dear, to lose so much when we had our hearts set upon it. So it is, said Mr. Sikes. Worse luck. A long silence ensued, during which the Jew was plunged into deep thought, with his face wrinkled into an expression of villainy perfectly demonicated. Sikes eyed him furtively from time to time. Nancy, apparently fearful of irritating the housebreaker, sat with her eyes fixed upon the fire, as if she had been deaf to all that passed. Fagin, said Sikes, abruptly breaking the stillness that prevailed, is it worth 50 extra shiners if it's safely done from the outside? Yes, said the Jew, as if suddenly rousing himself. Is it a bargain? Inquired Sikes. Yes, my dear, yes, rejoined the Jew, his eyes glistening, and every muscle in his face working, with an excitement that the inquiry had awakened. Then, said Sikes, thrusting aside the Jew's hand with some disdain, let it come off as soon as you like. Toby and I were over the garden wall a fortnight afore last, sounding the panels of the door and the shutters. The crib's barred up at night like a jail, but there's one part we can crack, safe and softly. Which is that, Bill? Asked the Jew eagerly. Why, Sikes whispered, as you cross the lawn. Yes, yes, said the Jew, bending his head forward, his eyes almost staring out of it. Humph! Cried Sikes, stopping short, as the girl, scarcely moving her head, looked suddenly around, and pointed for an instant at the Jew's face. Never mind which part it is, you can't do it without me, I know it. But it best be on the safe side when one deals with the likes of you. As you like, my dear, as you like, replied the Jew. There is no help wanted but yours and Toby's. None, said Sikes, except a centre bit, and a boy. The first we've got both, and the second you must find us. A boy, exclaimed the Joy. Oh, then it's a panel then, eh? Never mind what it is, replied Sikes. I want a boy, and he mustn't be a big one, Lord, said Mr. Sikes reflectively. If only I'd got that young boy off Ned, the chimbley sleepers. That'd keep him He kept him small on purpose, and then let him out by the job. But the father gets lagged, and then the Juvenile Delinquency Society comes and takes the boy away from a trade where he was earning money, and teaches him to read and write, and in time makes apprentice of him. And so they go on, said Mr. Sikes, his wrath rising at the recollections of his wrongs. And so they go on, and if they've got money enough, which is Providence they've not, we should have half a dozen boys left in the whole trade in a year or two. No more should we, acquiesced the Jew, who had been considering this daring speech, and had caught the sentence at last. Bill, what now? Inquired Sikes. The Jew nodded his head toward Nancy, who was still gazing into the fire, and intimated by a sign that he would have her told to leave the room. Sikes shrugged his shoulders impatiently, as if he thought the precaution unnecessary, but he complied nevertheless by requesting Nancy fetch him a jug of beer. You don't want any beer, said Nancy, folding her arms and retaining her seat very composedly. I tell you I do, replied Sikes. Nonsense, rejoined the girl coolly. Go on, Fagin. I know what he's going to say. Bill, you needn't mind me. The Jew hesitated. Sikes looked from one to the other in some surprise. Why, don't you mind the old girl, do you, Fagin? He asked at length. You've known her long enough to trust her, or the devil's in it. She ain't one to blab, are you, Nancy? I should think not, replied the young lady, drawing her chair up to the table and putting her elbows upon it. No, my dear, I know you're not, said the Jew, but... And again the old man paused. But what? Inquired Sikes. I didn't know whether she might perhaps be out of sorts, you know, my dear, as she was the other night, replied the Jew. At this confession Nancy burst into a laugh, and swallowed a glass of brandy, and shook her head with an air of defiance, and burst into a sundry of exclamations. Keep the game going, never say die, and the like. These seemed to have at once to have the effect of reassuring both gentlemen, for the Jew nodded his head with a satisfied air, and resumed his seat, and Mr. Sikes did likewise. Now, Fagin, said Nancy with a laugh, tell Bill at once about Oliver. Ha! You're a clever one, my dear. The sharpest girl I ever saw, the Jew said, patting her on her neck. It was about Oliver I was going to speak, sure enough. Ha ha ha. What about him? Demanded Sikes. He's the boy for you, my dear, replied the Jew in a hoarse whisper, laying his finger alongside his nose, and grinning frightfully. He? Exclaimed Sikes. Have him, Bill, said Nancy. I would if I were in your place. He mayn't be up to much as he mayn't be so much up as any of the others, but that's not what you want. He's only to open the door for you. Depend upon it, he's a safe one, Bill. I know he is, rejoined Fagin. He's been in good training these last few weeks, and it's time he began to work for his bread. Besides, the others are all too big. Well, he is just the size I want, said Mr. Sikes, ruminating. And he will do everything you want, Bill, my dear, interposed the Jew. He can't help himself, that is, if you frighten him enough. Frighten him, echoed Sikes. It'll be no sham frightening, mind you. If there's anything queer about him once we get to work, in for a penny, in for a pound, you won't see him alive again, Fagin. Think of that before you send him. Mark my words, said the robber, poising a crowbar which he had drawn from under the bedstead. I've thought of it all, said the Jew with energy. I've had my eye close upon him, my dear, as close. Once let him feel that he is one of us. Once fill his mind with the idea that he has been a thief, and he is ours for his life. Oh, it couldn't have come out better, said the old man, crossing his arms across his breast, and drawing his head and shoulders into a heap, literally hugging himself for joy. Ours, said Sikes. Yours, you mean. Perhaps I do, my dear, perhaps I do, said the Jew with a shrill chuckle. Mine, if you like, Bill. And what, said Sikes, scowling fiercely on his agreeable friend, what makes you take so much pains about one chalk-faced kid when you know there are 50 boys snoozing about common gardens every night as you might have your pick and choose from? Because they're of no use to me, my dear, replied the Jew with some confusion. Not worth the taking. Their looks convict 'em when they get into trouble, and I lose 'em all. With this boy properly managed, my dears, I could do what I couldn't do with 20 of them. Besides, said the Jew, recovering his self-possession, he has us now if he can only give up his leg bail again, and he must be in the same boat with us. Never mind how he came to be there. It's quite enough for my power over him that he was in a robbery, and that's all I want. Now, how much better this is than being obliged to put the poor little boy out of the way, which would be dangerous, and we should lose by it besides. When is it to be done? Asked Nancy, stopping some rather turbulent exclamation on the part of Mr. Sikes, expressive of the disgust which he had received Fagin's affection of humanity. To be sure, said the Jew. When is it to be done, Bill? I planned with Toby the night after tomorrow, rejoined Sikes in a surly voice. If he heard nothing from me on the contrary. Good, said the Jew. There's no moon. No, rejoined Sikes. It's all arranged about bringing off the swag, is it? Asked the Jew. Sikes nodded. And about? It's all planned, rejoined Sikes, interrupting him. Never mind the particulars. You'd better bring the boy along here tomorrow night. I shall get off the stones an hour after daybreak, and then you hold your tongue and keep the melting pot ready. And that's all you've got to do. You hear me? That's all you have to do. After some discussion, in which the three took an active part, it was decided that Nancy should repair to the Jews the next evening, when the night had set in, and bring Oliver away with her, Fagin craftily observing that if he evinced any disinclination to the task, he would be more willing to accompany the girl who had so recently interfered on his behalf than anybody else. It was so solemnly arranged that poor Oliver should, for the purposes of contemplated expedition, be unreservedly consigned to the care and custody of Mr. William Sikes, and further, that said Sikes should deal with him as he thought fit, and should not be held responsible by the Jew for any mischance or evil that might befall the boy, or any punishment with which it might be necessary to visit on him. It being understood that to render this compact in this respect binding, any representations made by Mr. Sikes on his return should be required to be confirmed and corroborated in all important particulars by the testimony of the flash Toby Crackit. These preliminaries adjusted, Mr. Sikes proceeded to drink brandy at a furious rate, and flourish the crowbar in an alarming manner, and yelling forth at the same time most unmusical snatches of songs, mingled with wild exhortations. At length, in a fit of professional enthusiasm, he insisted on producing his box of housebreaking tools, which he had no sooner stumbled in with, and opened for the purpose of explaining the nature and properties of the various implements it contained, and the peculiar beauties of their constructions, than he fell over it upon the floor, and went to sleep where he fell. "Good night, Nancy," said the Jew, muffling himself up as before. "Good night." Their eyes met. The Jew scrutinized her narrowly. There was no flinching about the girl. She was as true and earnest in the manner as Toby Crackit could be himself. The Jew bade her good night, bestowing a sly kick upon the prostrate form of Mr. Sikes, while her back was turned, and groped down the stairs. "Always the way," muttered the Jew to himself as he turned homewards. "The worst of these women is, that a very little thing serves to call up some long-forgotten feeling, and the best of them is, that it never lasts. Ha ha, the man against the child for a bag of gold." Beguiling the time with these pleasant reflections, Mr. Fagin wended his way through mire and mud to his gloomy abode, where the Dodger was sitting up impatiently, awaiting his return. "Is Oliver abed? I want to speak with him," was his first remark when they descended the stairs. "Hours ago," replied the Dodger, throwing open the door. "There he is." The boy was lying fast asleep on a rude bed upon the floor, so pale with anxiety and sadness, and the closeness of his prison, that he looked like death, not death as it shows in the shroud and coffin, but in the guise when it wears life, but in its guise when it wears but in the guise it wears when life has just departed, when young and gentle spirit has but instant to flee to heaven, and the gross air of the world has not yet had time to breathe upon its changing dust to hallowed. "Not now," said the Jew, turning away softly. Tomorrow. And that is the end of our chapter. I hope you have enjoyed it, and we will see you next time. Bye, readers!